Hi guys, 'tis I, your CMC professor. I am actually broadcasting, not from West Virginia this time, but from the great state of Washington, spending some time after a conference in the San Juan Island chain. I'm actually in Orcas Island, and this is the most amazing part. I'm in a hobbit house. It's actually, though, look at that. I know, right? Um, I don't think hobbit house is the right term. It's more of a Ewok house because hobbits don't live in trees, but nonetheless, that's what the listing said. Um, anyway, totally jazzed about talking about some social network sites here. So jazzed. I have some hard apple cider. This is the first time I've had it. It actually kind of tastes like piss, but we're just getting loosey-goosey, so that's fine. Okay, so let's just run through your readings for this week. I just want to hit the highlights just like normal. So this is the first of 2 weeks that we're just going to be talking about social network sites. And I admit I had you read sort of a long piece, though hopefully breaking it down into certain sections made it a little bit more manageable. The honest truth is that I think that Reingold's a really easy person to read. He writes very accessibly. He just tends to drag things out a lot, and he tries to put a lot of information in each little section. So if you want to go to those other sections, they're really interesting, but obviously we're just going to be focusing on the page numbers that I have in your syllabus that I want you to focus on. The thing I want to point out first that's really not, I was disappointed it's not mentioned. There's truthfully not a whole lot of great readings on social network sites yet because it's a relatively new area of study. The stuff we've been talking about before, like everything from Walther's research, like on an impression management and social information processing. Remember, that stuff all started in the early 90s, and he was talking largely about these type of um, uh, computer-mediated communication tools that are used to develop relationships. The neat thing about social network sites is that we usually use them for relational maintenance. In fact, you'll notice that I'm saying social network sites and not social networking sites. Your readings will use both terms, but I sort of subscribe to the line of thought that a social networking site implies that it's used for networking, meaning developing relationships with people you don't know or you want to get to know better. And though we use some social network sites like LinkedIn, for example, for that, I think more often than not, we're just using it to maintain relationships with the people that we already have relationships with or to learn more about them. So it's not like we're developing new ties, we're sort of um, making stronger links with the ties that we already have. So again, they're social network sites and not social networking sites. In fact, one of the reasons I wanted you to start off by watching that Christakis uh, TED Talk, which is great. Again, the type of thing. If you just get the first 10 minutes, that's super. If you want to watch the whole 18, it's really interesting. Is because he's a researcher who studies social networks, not social network sites, social networks. And the point I really want you to understand is that social networks have always been around, right? We've always lived in social networks, and what he's studying is how we organize ourselves socially. The only thing that's really changed with social network sites is now we can see them. Now, the social networks that have always been around, that we've always used, that we've always have always provided us lots of resources, um, they're visible, and we can see other people's social networks. So, and we can see how our social networks link with other social networks. So that's what I want us to think a lot about: is what are the implications of that visibility? Because that's really what putting social network sites on or putting social networks on social network sites in computer-mediated communication has changed. Um, so let's see. Make sure before I move on from Christakis, we covered all the interesting stuff. Um, Oh, well, I actually, before we move on, I will say that even before, again, social network sites came along, we've always lived in social networks, fine. They've always influenced us. And that's another thing I wanted you to really understand from the TED Talk that you listened to. That's really what his research focuses on. He talks about how if you are in a social network where everybody's obese, it actually increases your chances of being obese. And probably not for the reasons that you suspect. This is a question on your reading quiz, right? It's not because birds of a feather flock together, right? That obese people would happen to be obese. It's actually because our social networks change our perception of what's normal, or they influence our perception of what's normal, because it's not just who we're hanging out with, right? But it's their friends, right? It's the friends of friends. Now, interestingly, if you caught it, the same thing applies in social network sites, but not to the same extent, because our networks are much bigger. So in a social network site, there is still that influence, right? There is still that ability for our perceptions of social norms to change, and therefore us to be somewhat affected by what people in our social network are doing. The only difference is that Christakis and Fowler's research suggests, of course, that it's only the influence only really holds for people that we are in pictures with, for people that we get tagged with. And I think that speaks to the fact that our social network sites are capturing a much larger social network than we had before these things were visible online. So just food for thought there. Anyway, okay, so just to go back to this original point I made about how us now talking about social network sites moves us from talking about relationship development and impression management into relationship maintenance. Predominantly, we're using these tools, even things like LinkedIn, for relational maintenance. I'll scratch your back, you'll scratch mine. This helps me keep in touch with people from high school and my colleagues from work, and a whole array of people that I've met mostly offline. Mostly, we do sometimes meet new people on Facebook, but usually it's through people that we already know. Twitter's a little bit different. You know, each social network site has sort of their own uh, their own vibe, right, as far as what types of ties you're getting into. And speaking of ties, Reingold talks about different types of ties that we can maintain. There were three specifically, and actually, I'll tell you the truth. Two is usually what I only see discussed in the research, but we'll talk about all three. Um, you've got strong ties, right? Those are the types of ties that you think about as being true friends, friends with a capital or lowercase f, really, right? The friends like that you would go and you would actually have a beer with, right? Then you've got like weak ties, which are more of these. They're Facebook friends, right? That's the type of a friend that maybe you're technically tied to on Facebook, but you might not even have any sort of interaction. Or if you have interaction, it's more because they're acquaintances, right? Occasionally liking something. And actually, Reingold talks about this notion of an absent tie, which implies that there are ties that you have with people on social network sites that really, if it weren't for these social network sites, you probably wouldn't even have the tie. They would be completely absent. These are the people who, after you left high school, and I know some of you guys are very near to that still, but the idea would be that, or maybe here's a more salient example. People that you met in summer camp in seventh grade, right? Uh, Normally, those are the types of people that you might not even have ties with 5 or 6 years later, unless you became pen pals or that sort of thing. But thanks to Facebook, those absent ties are still in your network, even if you don't interact with them hardly at all. So it's kind of like one step below the weak tie. And the other interesting thing is that all of these ties, right, can contribute to this very positive notion that Reingold talks about of social capital. And there are various, you'll see this if you take other communication classes, probably various definitions of social capital. I like to think about it as just knowing that you have people around who can help you. And there are some people in your life, right, that if you needed $100 would be willing to loan it to you. There's probably more people in your life that if you needed $5 or if you needed change for something like a soft drink machine, right? Those are the types of people that you could go and ask for help. So there's varying degrees of it, but the idea is people with more social capital in their life are more social. They tend to have more trust, and there's all sorts of positive outcomes in terms of health. People with high levels of social capital, with more people around them that they can draw from, have better health, longer lives, engage in more civic activities, including things like voting or participation in local communities. So there's all sorts of reasons why communication researchers are interested in social capital as just a concept, right? And what we know from social network site research is that social capital comes from all these strong, weak, and even absent ties, okay? And the neat thing is that because of all those ties, the research suggests that we actually have increased social capital. So these websites are actually helping in many ways to drive that social capital up. And Reingold, of course, talks about three different types of social capital. Once again, there's only two that I had really, I see in the research, coming up frequently, just like the strong and weak ties, but we'll go through all three. Bridging, bonding, and linking social capital. Okay, so bridging social capital is the type of stuff that you'd probably think about with weak ties. So it's bringing people together that have kind of similar interests. Okay, this is like if you maybe were a big Game of Thrones fan or something, and you were looking for fan information or something like that on social network sites, and you weren't necessarily talking with your closest friends, but you were finding information through these weak ties that you had made on social network sites. Bonding social capital is a little bit deeper. Bonding social capital, right, comes from the people that are willing to loan you $100 or $500 or from your closest friends. And then there's linking social capital, which is actually the type of social capital we can get from people that we might not know very well at all, but can still help us out in different ways. And the cool thing is that the research suggests that use of social network sites can increase all three types of social capital. If you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. We're connecting with these various different types of ties, and lo and behold, right, we get all different types of social capital benefits from it. So, anyway, the only other thing I want to sort of bring up that leads us into the next the next stuff that you're going to be reading next week is that's all good, right? That we have these benefits from using social network sites. We get greater social capital, maybe even feel less lonely, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But what else has changed that maybe makes our lives a little bit more difficult? Positive in some ways, but also difficult. And it's this concept of context collapse. And the best way I know to explain context collapse is thinking about when it happened before social network sites. So what we're talking about with context collapse is where it used to be that we had different groups of people and we could keep them all separate. And that was useful because if we didn't want our parents to run into our teachers, then that's great because we see the teachers at school and you see the parents at home, fantastic. If you didn't want this group of friends to meet your other group of friends, that's great because whenever they're going to meet, have this group of friends maybe at school and you have this group of friends with your extracurricular activities, great. Wonderful. Everybody's separate. You can keep them in their neat little packages and you get to be whoever you want in these different groups. So if you're a drama kid and you want to be a drama kid with your drama friends, but you want to be a band kid, this is all very personal for me. You want to be a band kid with your band friends and you can do all that. The problem with social network sites is that it collapses those contexts. Now we have a site where all of your friends, all of your teachers, all of your parents can come and you have to sort of decide what face you want to put on, right? So this is where we get into sticky issues about what kind of status updates are you going to leave if everybody can see it, because you can't, it's more difficult to tailor make those types of status updates. As I was going to say earlier, the best type of comparison I've heard for this is a wedding. Before social network sites, this did happen, but much more rare. It was a much more rare occurrence. Usually it's some sort of event like a wedding where everybody's family comes, both sides of the family, for the groom's side and the bride's side or whatever, and then all the friends, all the colleagues, everybody sort of in the same room, and awkwardness can ensue. Anyway, we'll talk a little bit more about this when we read the readings for next week, but I want you to think about sort of the challenges that come up because of context collapse on social network sites, and I also want you to maybe start thinking about what are some strategies that we can use to get around some of those challenges. So, okay, I think that covers it. Signing off from the Hobbit House in the Trees, the Ewok House, whatever it is.